Roberts. It's been 10 years since NATO launched its bombing campaign on Serbia during the Kosovo War. The assault killed thousands and caused many more to flee. Well, we're joined live now by our correspondents, Paula Slier in Belgrade and Alexei Yaroshelski in Moscow. Let's start with you, Paula. How did Serbia mark today's anniversary?
Well, throughout the day, 10 commemorations were held at places that NATO bombed 10 years ago. At all Orthodox churches in Serbia, the bells rang to remember those victims of those bombings, both civilians and soldiers. At noon, a siren sounded and a minute of silence was observed. Now, noon was the time when, on the 10th of June, the last bombs fell and Slobodan Milosevic officially announced that the war was over. At noon today, there was a memorial service that was held at the state television, and this was to remember the 16 employees who died there when NATO bombed the TV headquarters. Right now, as I'm speaking to you, there's a rally in downtown Belgrade. Some 1,500 people have turned up. They are demanding that the Serbian government have nothing to do with NATO countries. They're also demanding that the Serbian government have nothing to do with the West. In Kosovo, in the Serbian enclave of Pristina, this evening at exactly 7:45, a rally began commemorating these NATO bombings. 7:45 was the time that the first bombs fell on Pristina, and this rally will continue tonight until 12:44. 12:44 being the number of the United Nations resolution that brought an end to the fighting.
Thank you, Paula. Now, Alexei, we've just heard from Paula about what's going on in Belgrade with the memorial service and the rally. You're in Moscow, near the Serbian embassy. Did people gather there to commemorate?
Yes, indeed. We're seeing about 30-odd activists of a youth organization here in snowy Moscow in front of the Serbian embassy. They have gathered here to commemorate the events of a decade ago when the NATO troops started bombing Belgrade. They put a banner there on the wall saying that we remember, we commemorate, and we will never forget. They've also brought flowers and candles to form the number 89. This is exactly how many children were killed in the bombings of Yugoslavia 10 years ago. Now, the fact that this is happening in Moscow is hardly a surprise. We know that Russia has been taking the stance of Serbia ever since the conflict began. It's been supporting Serbia. Moreover, Russian peacekeepers were the first ones to enter Yugoslavia 10 years ago, to enter Kosovo, 10 years ago. And this stance basically has been reiterated by the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who said that the views on this conflict, the views on what happened 10 years ago in Russia have not changed the slightest ever since. And Russia still says no to recognizing Kosovo as independent state. It supports Belgrade in a view that Kosovo must be a part of Serbia.
Alexei, thank you. Back to you, Paula. After 10 years, what do people in Serbia think of the NATO bombardments now?
Well, Serbian people really are divided. There's a small majority who believe that while it is important to acknowledge and remember the NATO bombings of 10 years ago, the country needs to move forward. And they believe that the way the country can move forward, and this is a position that is held by the government, is by embracing the European Union and embracing Western powers. These are also people who, when it came to the fight to not allow Kosovo to become independent, they fought that fight peacefully. They petitioned the international community. They held peaceful demonstrations. On the other hand, there are a lot of Serbs who are still angry about the NATO bombings. They are calling on the government to have nothing to do with the West. They say that these bombings were an unlawful aggression against Serbia and against the Serbian people. Today, as we reflect on 10 years after those bombings, questions are still being asked here in Serbia just how effective those bombs were in increasing the cancer levels of people who live in those areas where those bombs fell. And according to officials here, the number of cancer patients have increased as much as 3-fold since then. This is what people had to say.
He doesn't give us his name, but he gives us the names of those who buried in this little cemetery. There's Joko Zelenovic, who worked in the military repair factory. There's Dejan Elčić, who died at the age of 65. And there's a 35-year-old mother of 2 small children. They all died of cancer. In this small Serbian village in eastern Bosnia, there used to be 1 or 2 funerals a year. But ever since NATO dropped bombs on Sarajevo in the summer of 1995, that number's climbed to as many as 1 or 2 a month. Nikola Zelenovic's parents are buried here. He says they were healthy until the NATO bombings and is now spearheading an investigation.
My family lived throughout the war years in the town of Hadjici. My father was working in one of the factories there when NATO bombed it. His health problems started soon afterwards. He died from lung cancer. My mother died a year and a half later from leukemia. My parents were never sick before.
On March the 24th, 1999, and for the next 3 months, NATO bombed Serb targets in the former Republic of Yugoslavia. 4 years earlier, its forces had bombed Bosnia-Herzegovina. Their aim was to end the fighting. But in the years that followed, hundreds of people living in the areas they hit have died of cancer. In Kosovo, the number of cancer patients has grown 3 times over the last 10 years, while in Bosnia-Herzegovina, already more than 1,000 people have died of cancer. Dr. Slavko Zdrale has treated more than 300 patients.
A few years ago, we started noticing that there was as many as 5 times the number of people dying of different kinds of cancer than compared with the number of people who'd been sick before the war. We worked out that 90% of them came from areas NATO had bombed and from areas where there was ammunition used with uranium.
In Pale, the War Crimes Court is recording the evidence. It says the pieces of ammunition found in the bombed areas had a much higher level of radiation than is internationally allowed. Staff here are convinced the radiation caused the cancers.
We believe this was a deliberate attempt by NATO forces to kill as many people as possible. It was also a chance for the West to test new weapons, but there is nothing we can do. We cannot file any complaint against NATO because all those involved have diplomatic immunity. A NATO soldier can kill and never be prosecuted, but maybe one day some senior officials from NATO who ordered the bombings can be prosecuted. I believe the order came from high up.
NATO hasn't commented on the claims, and aside from Serbian and Italian investigations, there hasn't been any other independent research. This little cemetery in Bratunac is already full, but locals fear the number of cancer victims will continue to grow for at least the next 50 years, or for as long as it takes for the air to clean. It's almost impossible to find people to talk to who are sick with cancer because most of them are dead. It's now 10 years since NATO bombed Serb targets. NATO has a lot to answer for. Assuming it ever does, and there's no reason to think it will, those answers will always be too late for people buried here. Pauluslia, RT, Bratunac, the Republic of Serbia.